The Black Ships of Umbar, the Shadow's Last Gambit. In the days when the shadow of Sauron had not yet fallen utterly from Middle-earth, when the echoes of the War of the Ring still whispered through the halls of Minas Tirith, there came tidings from the southern seas that filled the hearts of wise men with unease. The great harbor of Umbar, that ancient fastness of the corsairs, had grown strangely quiet, as if the very waters held their breath in anticipation of some dark design. Captain Thorongil of Dol Amroth, though that was not the name by which he was known in the records of his own people, stood upon the white walls of his city, gazing southward toward the distant smudge of smoke that marked the corsair stronghold. The sea wind bore strange scents, not merely salt and seaweed, but something fouler, as if the very air had been corrupted by malevolent purpose. "My lord," came a voice behind him, and Thorongil turned to see Baranor, his most trusted captain, approaching with swift steps. "The scouts have returned from their watch upon the Anduin's mouth. They bring word that troubles the heart." Thorongil's gray eyes that had seen the rise and fall of the Dark Lord himself, fixed upon his subordinate. "Speak freely, Baranor. What moves in the south?" "Ships, my lord. Not the swift galleys of the corsairs that we know well, but vessels of a different make entirely. Black they are as the pit of Morgoth, and their sails drink in light as a desert drinks water. Our watchers count a score and more, all anchored in the deep channels where the great war dromons once lay." A shadow passed over Thorongil's face, though the sun shone bright above. In his long years, longer than most men might guess, he had learned to read the signs when darkness stirred in forgotten corners of the world. "Have they taken any action? Do they make ready for war?" "Nay, my lord. They lie as still as death itself. But there is this that gives the watchers pause. No man has been seen upon their decks, neither by day nor by night. Yet smoke rises from their hold, and lights move within their cabins like will-o'-the-wisps in a haunted marsh." The Prince of Dol Amroth was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping the stone battlement. Far below, the harbor of his city sparkled in the afternoon sun, filled with the honest ships of fishermen and merchants. Yet even as he watched, a cloud seemed to pass over the water, though the sky remained clear. "Send word to King Elisar," he said at length. "Tell him that the south stirs again, and that we keep watch. But say also this: whatever force gathers in Umbar is not of the common run of pirates and sea thieves. Something else commands those black ships, something that may have slept long in the deep, but now wakes to purpose." As Baranor departed to carry out his orders, Thorongil remained upon the wall, his thoughts turning to older days and darker memories. He had sailed to Umbar once in his youth, in a different guise and under another name, and had there learned that not all the perils of Middle-earth dwelt in Mordor or Isengard. The sea held its own sea, and some of them were older than the malice of Sauron. The sun sank toward the western horizon, painting the sea in shades of gold and crimson. But to Thorongil's eyes, the southern waters seemed touched with a deeper darkness, as if night fell there first, and most completely. Before the stars appeared, he had already begun to gather his captains for council, knowing that the peace they had enjoyed since the downfall of the Dark Tower might soon be tested by trials yet unimagined. In the harbor of Umbar, 23 black ships rode at anchor, their hulls glistening like the carapaces of great beetle. No wind stirred their ebon sails, yet they seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if vast hearts beat within their holds. And in the deepest chamber of the greatest ship, something that had waited long in patience began to stir, remembering ancient oaths and older hungers. The Shadow's last gambit was about to begin. 7 days had passed since the black ships first appeared in the harbor of Umbar, and still they remained motionless, like great carrion birds perched upon a field of battle. In the Tower of Ecthelion, King Elisar stood in his high chamber, reading again the message that had come by swift rider from Dol Amroth. The parchment bore the familiar hand of Thorongil, though few in the city knew that the prince and their king had once shared deeper counsel than those of mere allies. "My Lord King," the letter read, "the Watchers report no change in the southern fleet. They remain as death anchored, yet there are signs that give the wise cause for concern. The very sea about them has grown dark, as if stained by some corruption that spreads outward from their hulls. Fish flee these waters, and seabirds will not fly above them. More troubling still, the lighthouse keepers of the Anduin's Mouth report that their flames burn low when the wind blows from the south, and that strange voices may be heard upon that wind, voices that speak in no tongue of men. Aragorn set down the message and turned to gaze out upon his city. From his high window, he could see the white houses climbing the mountainside, the busy market, the children playing in the garden. All seemed peaceful, yet he felt the familiar weight of kingship upon his shoulders, the burden of protecting all this beauty and life from the darkness that ever sought to devour it. A soft knock came at his door. "Enter!" he called, and was not surprised to see Faramir, Prince of Ithilien, step into the chamber. The steward's face was grave, and he bore in his hands a scroll sealed with black wax. "My king," Faramir said, bowing slightly. "A ship has come up the Anduin under cover of darkness. She flew no banner, and her crew would speak to none save the king himself. They bear this message, and swear it comes from Umbar itself." Aragorn took the scroll, noting how cold it felt beneath his fingers, as if it had been stored in ice rather than carried across warm seas. The seal bore no device that he recognized, only a strange sigil that seemed to writhe and change when he looked upon it directly. He broke the seal and unrolled the parchment. The script was fair and flowing, written in the common tongue, yet something in the very ink seemed to whisper of ancient malice. To Elisar Tel-Contar, who names himself King of Gondor and Arnor, greetings from the deep waters. Know that the time of reckoning draws near, and that old debts shall be paid in full. The sea remembers what the land forgets, and the children of Númenor shall answer for the sins of their fathers. When next the moon wanes to darkness, look to the southern waters, and know that the Black Fleet comes not for conquest alone, but for justice, long delayed. We are the heirs of older crowns than yours, Dunedain, and our claim reaches back to the foundation of the world. The message bore no signature, only the same writhing sigil that had sealed it. Faramir watched his king's face grow pale as he read. "What does it say, my lord?" "Riddles and threats," Aragorn replied, though his voice carried an undertone of deeper concern. "Yet there is knowledge in these words that troubles me. This writer knows names and histories that few now remember. Tell me, Faramir, in all your study of the ancient lore, have you ever encountered mention of the children of Númenor being called to account for some great sin?" The Prince of Ithilien frowned, his scholar's mind working through half-remembered texts. "There are dark tales, my lord, of the latter days of Númenor before its drowning. Ar-Pharazôn the Golden led a great fleet against the undying lands themselves, seeking to wrest immortality from the Valar. For this hubris, the island was swallowed by the sea, and most of its people perished. But some escaped, the faithful followers of Elendil, who became the founders of Gondor and Arnor. And what of those who did not follow Elendil?" Aragorn asked quietly. "What became of the servants of Ar-Pharazôn, who might have survived the downfall?" A chill seemed to settle over the chamber as the implications of the question became clear. Faramir's eyes widened. You think these black ships carry descendants of the king's men? The very followers of Ar-Pharazôn himself? "I think," Aragorn said grimly, "that the sea holds longer memories than we have given it credit for. Summon the Council of Gondor. Send swift messengers to Rohan, to Lothlorien, to all our allies. If my fears prove true, we face not merely pirates and raiders, but something far older and more dangerous. The last remnant of Númenor's pride, risen from the depths to claim what they believe is their birthright." As night fell over Minas Tirith, the city's bells began to ring, calling the great and wise to urgent council. In the harbor of Umbar, the black ships stirred at last, their dark sails beginning to fill with wind that blew from no earthly quarter. The moon waned toward darkness, and with each passing hour, the shadow upon the southern waters grew deeper and more menacing. The game was afoot, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of all Middle-earth. The great hall of the citadel had not seen such a gathering since the coronation of King Elisar. Lords and captains filled the benches beneath the white tree's banner, their faces grim in the torchlight. At the high table sat the king himself, with Faramir at his right hand, and Imrahil of Dol Amroth, newly arrived from his sea watch. The very air seemed heavy with portent. "My lords," Aragorn began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "we are met in dark purpose. A threat rises from the south that may prove unlike any we have faced before. You have all heard the reports from our watchers at Umbar. Now hear also this." He read aloud the strange message, with its cryptic threats and ancient claims. When he finished, a murmur ran through the assembly like wind through wheat. Prince Imrahil rose first, his sea cloak still damp from his swift journey. "My king, I have sailed those waters for 30 years, and I tell you truly, what anchors now in Umbar's harbor is no natural fleet. The very dolphins flee their presence, and the seagulls cry, as if in mourning. More than this, our spies in the port report that the townspeople speak of voices in the night, calling in the ancient tongue of Numenor. The corsairs themselves have barricaded their houses and dare not venture near the black ships." Lord Hurin of the Keys, aged but still keen of wit, leaned forward. "The ancient tongue, you say? I have studied the lore of the downfall in the archives of Minas Tirith. It is written that when Numenor fell, not all of Ar-Pharazôn's fleet was in the harbor. Some ships had sailed to distant waters on voyages of exploration and conquest. Could it be that survivors of that proud and corrupted realm have endured these long ages in exile?" "Endured how?" demanded Forlong's heir, now Lord of Lossarnach. 3,000 years have passed since the downfall. No mortal men could live so long, even with the extended life of the Númenórean. Aragorn exchanged a meaningful glance with Faramir. "There are other ways to endure, my lords, ways that are a curse rather than a blessing. In the libraries of Rivendell, I once read of the oath-breakers who were condemned to undeath until their transgression was healed. What if there are others, bound by different oaths or darker curses, who have wandered the seas these long years, seeking what? Revenge? Redemption? Or perhaps the fulfillment of some promise made in Númenor's dying days?" A young captain from Pelargir stood, his face pale. "My king, there is more. My ship encountered a fishing vessel 3 days past, sailing north from the mouths of Anduin. The fishermen were half mad with terror, babbling of shapes beneath the water. Vast shapes that paced their boat for leagues, always just beyond the reach of sight. They swore they heard singing from the depths, songs in the drowned tongue of the Sea Kings. The hall fell silent, save for the guttering of torches and the distant sound of wind against the tower's walls. Imrahil spoke again, his voice troubled. "If we face the lost remnant of Númenor's might, we must consider what they seek." The message spoke of justice and old debts. What wrong could we have done them, that they would threaten war after so many centuries? Faramir had been silent, but now he rose, a heavy tome in his hands. "I have spent the day in the archives, seeking answers to that very question. Here, in the Chronicle of Isildur, is written a thing that has long puzzled the lore masters." He opened the book and read, "And when the great ships of the king came to the havens of Umbar, Isildur turned them away, saying that no servant of the usurper should find haven in the lands of the faithful. Yet some there were who pleaded for mercy, claiming they had repented of their master's folly. These Isildur numbered with the mouth-speaker, and set upon them a curse and a binding, that they should not rest in any haven, nor find peace in any harbor, until the line of Elendil should grant them pardon, or until the world's end should free them." A chill ran through the assembly as the implications became clear. Aragorn slowly stood, his face grave as stone. "The mouth-speaker," he said quietly. "Those who proclaimed Ar-Pharazôn's defiance to the valor themselves, who spoke the words that brought down the wrath of Eru upon Númenor. Isildur cursed them to wander the sea, and I am the last of his line. They come seeking pardon, Imrahil breathed, or perhaps to force it from you at sword point. But the message spoke of debts and justice. Hurin protested. These sound more like threats, petitions for mercy. Aragorn nodded grimly. 3,000 years of exile can corrupt even the noblest heart. If they still live, if you can call their existence life, what might they have become in all those ages of wandering? What bargains might they have made with the darkness to sustain themselves? What oaths sworn to powers that care nothing for the fate of Middle-earth? The king looked around the assembly, seeing in their faces the reflection of his own fears. We cannot know their true purpose until they reveal it. But this I know. If they are indeed the last remnant of Númenor's sea power, then they command forces beyond our easy reckoning. The fleets of Ar-Pharazôn were the mightiest that ever sailed the circles of the world, and their knowledge of the sea's ways was beyond that of any other mariner. What would you have us do, my king? Asked the Lord of Lossarnach. Aragorn was quiet for a long moment, staring at the white tree carved above the great doors. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of kingship and the burden of ancient bloodlines. We prepare for war, but we also prepare for parley. If they seek pardon, I will hear their petition, for I am indeed the heir of Isildur, and the curse he laid may only be lifted by his line. But if they come with conquest in their hearts, they will find that the men of Gondor are not the same folk who once trembled before Númenor's might. As the council dispersed to make ready for whatever might come, none noticed the dark clouds gathering above the southern horizon, nor the way the very stars seemed to dim when that wind blew from the sea. In Umbar's harbor, the black ships had begun to move at last, their course set northward toward the mouths of Anduin. The reckoning was at hand. 5 days after the Council of the White Tree, the watchman at Harlond sent word that struck fear into the hearts of all who heard it. Sails upon the horizon, black as midnight, and many beyond counting. The fleet of Umbar had come north at last, and with it rode such a gathering of dread as had not been seen since the black ships of the corsairs sailed to their doom at the Pelennor. Yet these were no corsair vessels. As they drew closer to the great port of Gondor, their true nature became clear to those who watched from the white walls. Ships they were indeed, but ships such as no living shipwright had ever built. Their hulls rose from the water like the bones of leviathans, black and gleaming, with an oily sheen that seemed to drink in the light of the sun. Their sails were not cloth, but something that moved like shadow made solid, billowing with winds that touched no other vessel in the harbor. Upon the highest tower of the citadel, King Elisar stood with his captains, watching the dread fleet approach. Through a far-seeing glass crafted in Rivendell, he could make out details that chilled his warrior's heart. The ships bore figureheads carved in the likeness of the great eagles of Númenor, but these were twisted and corrupt, their eyes gleaming with malevolent fire. Along their sides ran script in the ancient Elvish letters, but the words they spelled were in the proud tongue of the Sea King. 27 ships, reported Imrahil, who had been counting through his own glass, each one larger than our greatest war galley. And see how they move. No oars disturb the water, yet they come against the wind as if it were at their backs. Faramir pointed toward the lead vessel, a massive dromond that dwarfed all the others. That ship, the writing on its prow. Can you make it out, my king? Aragorn adjusted his glass and read the ancient letters aloud. Alcarondas, the castle of the waves. I know that name from the old chronicles. It was Ar-Pharazôn's own flagship, the greatest ship ever built in Númenor's yards. A silence fell over the watcher. If the Alcarondas truly sailed before them, then they faced not merely survivors of the downfall, but the very captains who had served the last king of Númenor in his mad assault upon the undying lands. As the Black Fleet drew closer, a strange thing began to happen. The waters of the Anduin, which had run clear and bright that morning, began to darken, not with mud or silt, but with something deeper and more troubling, as if the very memory of sorrow had stained the river. Fish floated belly up upon the surface, and the seabirds that usually thronged the harbor took wing in great flocks, fleeing northward with cries of distress. "My lord king," came a voice from behind them, and they turned to see a messenger from the port, his face white with fear. "The harbor master sends word that all the ships in port are taking on water, though their hulls show no breach. The dockworkers speak of voices beneath the piers, voices that call for justice in the old tongue." Before Aragorn could reply, a new sound reached their ears, the deep, resonant boom of a war horn, unlike any heard in Middle-earth for 3 millennia. It came from the Alcarondas, and its note seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. Windows rattled in their frames, and dogs throughout Minas Tirith began to howl. Then, as the echoes of the horn died away, another sound arose, more terrible than any battle cry. It was singing, if such a word could be applied to the voices that now carried across the water. Deep and mournful, like the lament of the sea itself, it rose from every ship in the Black Fleet. The words were in Adunaic, the tongue of Númenor, and though few in the city could understand them, their meaning was clear to any who heard. This was a song of exile and loss, of pride humbled and glory turned to ash. Aragorn found that his hands were trembling as he gripped the stone parapet. The song spoke to something deep in his blood, the heritage of Númenor that flowed in the veins of all the Dúnedain. He could feel the weight of ancient griefs, the echo of that terrible day when the greatest isle in the world had vanished beneath the wave. "Sire," Imrahil said urgently, "they have raised a banner." Upon the Alcarondas's mainmast, a great standard now flew, not the black banner of pirates or the red flag of war, but something far more significant. It was deep blue as the ocean depths, and upon it was wrought in silver the tree of Númenor, the great Malorn that had grown in the court of the king. But this tree was shown withered and fallen, its roots exposed and its branches broken. "The tree of sorrow," Faramir whispered, his lore master's knowledge serving him well. It was the banner raised by the exiles when they fled the downfall, a sign of mourning for all that was lost. As if summoned by the sight of that banner, memories not his own began to stir in Aragorn's mind. He saw in vision the great harbor of Romena, as it had been in the days of glory, filled with ships whose white sails caught the light of Arundil's star. He saw the tall towers of Armenelos rising toward the sky, and the golden beaches where the children of Elros had walked in the light of the two trees' kindred. All gone now, swallowed by the hungry sea. Yet here sailed a remnant, preserved by what dark arts he dared not guess, carrying their sorrow and their rage across the centuries like a curse that would not die. The Black Fleet had come to anchor now, just beyond the harbor mouth, their massive forms blocking the passage to the sea. No hostile action had they taken, no weapon shown, yet their very presence was a threat that needed no word. They waited, as the tide waits for the turning of the moon, patient and inexorable. From the Alcarondas came a single boat, rowed by figures cloaked in gray. It moved across the water with unnatural speed, leaving no wake behind it. And as it approached the royal quay, those who watched could see that its occupants cast no shadows, though the sun shone bright above. "They come to parley," Aragorn said, straightening his shoulders and settling the crown of Gondor more firmly upon his brow. "Whatever they are now, they were once men, and men may be reasoned. Prepare the throne hall. We shall hear what the children of Númenor have to say to the heir of Isildur." As he turned to go, the mournful singing from the black ships swelled to a crescendo, and it seemed to all who heard it that the very stones of the city wept for sorrows too deep for healing. The Fleet of Sorrows had come home at last. The throne hall of Gondor had been prepared as for the reception of kings. Banners of the White Tree hung from the pillars, and the guards stood arrayed in their finest mail, silver and black. Upon the throne of stone sat Elisar, crowned and robed in the full majesty of his kingship, with Andúril bare across his knees. At his right hand stood Faramir, Prince of Ithilien, and at his left Prince Imrahil, their faces grave beneath the weight of what was to come. The great doors opened with a sound like thunder, and the herald's voice rang out, "Let the embassy of the fleet approach the throne." They entered in single file, 7 figures robed in gray, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. They moved with a strange, gliding gait, as if they walked upon water rather than stone, and the very air seemed to grow cold at their passage. Behind them came no guard, no standard-bearer, no display of earthly power, only the profound weight of ages and the lingering scent of the sea. As they drew near the throne, the foremost figure raised his hands and drew back his hood. A gasp ran through the assembled court, for the face revealed was noble beyond mortal measure, yet terrible in its beauty. The features were those of the high Numenorian, keen-eyed and wise, with the majesty that had made them kings among lesser men. But the skin was pale as pearl, and the eyes held depths like the abyss. When he spoke, his voice carried the sound of waves upon distant shores. "Hail, Elisar Telkantar, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur and Elendil. I am Farazir, who was once called Lord Admiral of the Western Fleet in the service of Tar Palantir the Wise, and later in the dark days served him who named himself Ar-Pharazôn the Golden. I speak for those who have wandered long in the exile of waters, bearing the burden of Isildur's curse and our own folly." The king studied the figure before him, seeing in those ageless features the nobility that had once made Numenor the wonder of the world, now twisted by ages of sorrow and the unnatural preservation of undeath. "I hear you, Farazir of Numenor. Speak your purpose in coming to these shores." The admiral, for such he clearly was, despite the long years, bowed with the grace of one bred to courts and kingdom. "We come seeking that which has been denied us for 3,000 years, an end to wandering, rest for the weary, and peace for those who have known only the salt tears of the sea. The curse of Isildur binds us still to the waves, denying us the death that is the gift of Eru to mortal men. You alone, last heir of Elendil's line, have the power to grant us release." Faramir leaned forward, his scholar's mind sharp, despite the strangeness of the moment. "You speak of Isildur's curse, yet the chronicles tell that he cursed only those who were oath-breakers. What oath did you swear and break that earned such punishment?" For the first time, something like pain flickered across Farazir's perfect features. When Ar-Pharazôn marshaled his great armament for the assault upon Valinor, all who served in his fleet were made to swear the Black Oath, to follow him even unto the undying lands, to stand with him before the thrones of the Valar themselves, and to claim by force what they would not grant by grace. This oath we swore, and this oath we kept, following our king into the very waters of the west, until Eru himself opened the earth and sea to swallow us. "Yet you survive," Imrahil observed. "How came you to live when Numenor itself perished?" "Live?" Farazir's laugh was like the crying of gulls over empty seas. "Call you this living prince of Dol Amroth? We died with our ships in the great cataclysm, drowned beneath mountains of water when the world was bent. Yet the Black Oath held us even in death, bound us to our ships, to our service, to the endless wandering until our king should command us to rest. But Ar-Pharazôn himself was taken by the Valar and buried beneath the mountains of the earth, leaving us without release, neither alive nor properly dead." Aragorn felt the weight of ancient sorrow pressing down upon the hall like a physical force. "And Isildur's curse, how came that upon you?" "When we sought refuge in the havens of the faithful, hoping that our repentance might earn us shelter from the storm of divine wrath, your ancestor turned us away. More than this, he laid upon us a binding that we should find no rest in any land, nor peace in any harbor, until the heir of his line should judge us worthy of forgiveness, or until the world's end should release us from our torment." The king was silent for a long moment, understanding now the full tragedy of what stood before him. 3,000 years you have wandered the sea, neither living nor dead, carrying your ships and your sorrow across all the waters of the world. "Aye," Farazar said simply. "We have seen the rise and fall of many kingdoms, watched the making and breaking of treaties and alliances, witnessed wars beyond counting. We have sailed every sea from the gray havens to the sundering waters of the far south, always seeking but never finding the peace that was denied us. Some among our number have fallen to madness, others to despair so deep that even the ocean's depths could not drown it. Yet still we endure, bound by oaths and curses that grow heavier with each passing age." "What would you have of me?" Aragorn asked, though in his heart he already knew the answer. "Release," Farazar said, and his voice carried the longing of millennia. "Grant us the forgiveness that Isildur withheld. Break the curse that binds us to this mockery of existence, and let us find at last the peace that is every mortal's birthright. We have paid 10 times over for our pride and folly. Surely 3,000 years of exile is punishment enough for any sin." The hall fell silent, save for the distant sound of wind and wave. Every eye turned to the king, waiting for his judgment. But before Aragorn could speak, another voice cut through the stillness, cold and mocking, speaking from the shadows behind the pillars. "Release? Forgiveness? How quickly they speak of redemption, these servants of the Black Oath. But tell them, Farazir, what price you have paid to preserve your ships and your crews through all these weary years. Tell the king what bargains you have made with the powers of the dark, what services you have rendered to keep your fleet together when by all rights it should have rotted away ages ago." All heads turned toward the shadows, and from them stepped a figure that chilled the blood of every man present, tall and terrible, clad in robes of black and silver that seemed to drink in the light. The face beneath the hood was fair but cold as winter, and the eyes burned with a fire that was not of this world. Farazir's face went white as sea foam, and his voice shook as he whispered a single word, "Angamite." The newcomer smiled, an expression terrible in its beauty. "Indeed, Angamate, the faithless. As you named me when I spoke truths you would not hear. Admiral of the Second Fleet, keeper of the Black Oath's deepest secret, I too have come to speak with the heir of Isildur, but my words shall tell a different tale than his." The game had changed in an instant, and Aragorn felt the first stirrings of dread as he realized that the mystery of the black ships was deeper and darker than any had imagined. The silence in the throne hall stretched taut as a bowstring, heavy with the weight of ancient hatreds and long-buried secrets. Farazir stood frozen, his noble features twisted with an emotion that might have been fear, while the figure called Angamate moved forward with the fluid grace of a predator approaching its prey. "Hold!" commanded King Elisar, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Who are you that dares enter uninvited into the hall of Gondor's king? Speak your name and purpose." Angamate halted before the throne, but offered no bow, no gesture of respect. Instead, he drew back his hood to reveal features that might once have been beautiful, but were now terrible in their cold perfection. "I am Angamate, once Lord Admiral of our Farazon's Second Fleet, keeper of the Palantir of the ships, and guardian of secrets that would freeze the blood in your vein, son of Arathorn. I come to ensure that you hear the full truth before you make any rash judgments about mercy and forgiveness." Faramir's eyes sharpened at the mention of a Palantir. The seeing stones of Numenor were 7 in number, and their fates are well recorded in our archives. No mention is made of any stone aboard the ships of the fleet. A cold smile played about Angamate's lips. "The chronicles of the faithful were incomplete, young prince. When our Farazon marshaled his armament for the assault upon Valinor, he commanded that an 8th stone be wrought, the Master Stone that would allow him to command all the others from afar. This stone was placed aboard my ship that the fleet might maintain communication across the vast waters of the west. When the cataclysm came and Numenor fell, this stone survived." Farazir found his voice at last, and it carried the weight of 3 millennia of regret. "Angamate speaks truth, though I would that he did not. The Palantir endured the downfall, And in our desperation, in our fear of the endless wandering that stretched before us, some among our number counseled that we use it to seek aid from any power that might offer it. "And you listened to this counsel?" Aragorn asked, though the coldness in his heart told him he already knew the answer. "Not at first," Farazar said sadly. "For 100 years, we wandered in what honor remained to us, seeking neither help nor harbor from any earthly power. But the curse ate at us like a cancer. Our ships began to fail, our crews to despair unto madness. We watched good men cast themselves into the sea rather than endure another day of the torment. It was then that Angamete spoke of the stone and of the voices that whispered to him in the dark hours of the night." "Voices," Imrahil said grimly. "What manner of voices?" Angamete's laugh was like ice breaking on a frozen shore. "Oh, there are many powers in the world that take interest in the desperate and the damned. Prince of Dol Amroth, the Dark Lord was not yet risen to his second dominion, but his servants stirred in the shadows, and they heard our plight. They offered preservation for our ships, strength for our crews, and purpose to fill the empty years of our exile. All they asked in return was service." The word fell into the hall like a stone into still water, sending ripples of horror through all who heard it. Aragorn's knuckles were white where he gripped the arms of his throne. "What manner of service?" "Small things, at first," Farazar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The sinking of ships that carried inconvenient cargo, the drowning of mariners who had learned too much of affairs that should remain hidden. We told ourselves it was but piracy, no different from the raiders of the corsairs. But as the years passed, the tasks grew darker. We became the unseen fleet of Mordor," Angamete said with evident pride. "When Sauron commanded, we obeyed. We harried the ships of Gil-galad during the War of the Last Alliance, though none knew whence came the attacks. We sank the vessels that might have brought aid to Gondor in her dark hours. We were the shadows on the water, the storm that came from clear skies, the reef that appeared where no reef should be. Even during the recent War of the Ring," Farazar added, shame heavy in his voice, "we served the Dark Tower. Though our hearts rebelled against it, the binding held us fast. We could no more refuse than a sword can refuse to cut when wielded by a strong hand." The hall erupted in angry voices as lords and captains grasped the full horror of what they were hearing. Here before them stood those who had served the enemy in secret, who had been the hidden hand behind countless disasters that had befallen the free people. Aragorn raised his hand for silence, and when it came, his voice was cold as winter. "You speak of binding and compulsion, yet you also speak of choices made. You chose to use the Palantir, chose to treat with the powers of darkness, chose to preserve your existence at the cost of innocent lives. How many good men lie drowned because of your service to the shadow? More than can be counted," Angamete said carelessly. "What matter a few mortal lives against the preservation of Númenor's last glory? We are the children of Arendil, the blood of the Star Kindler. Should we have simply faded away into death while lesser races inherited the earth?" But Farazar turned upon his fellow admiral with sudden fury. "Speak not so. We are murderers and slaves, corrupted by our own pride and the lies of the enemy. There is no glory in what we have become, no honor in the bargains we have made. We are a cancer upon the sea, and if death is the only cure for our condition, then death we should embrace. And yet," Angamete said smoothly, "death is not what we seek. Is it, noble Farazar? For I have news that may change your tune entirely. The Dark Lord is fallen, yes, but he was not the only power we serve. There are others, older, deeper, more patient in their malice, and they have made us an offer that even your conscience might find interesting." The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees as Angamete reached within his robes and drew forth something that made every man present step back in horror. It was a crystal, black as the void between the stars, and within its depths moved shapes that hurt the eye to look upon. "The 8th Palantir," Faramir breathed, but the stones were made by the elves of old, crafted with light and wisdom. This is an abomination. Corruption breeds corruption, Angamate said. The stone has fed upon our despair for 3,000 years, and in feeding, it has changed. It shows not what is, but what might be, the futures that the powers of darkness would bring to pass. And in its depths, I have seen a vision that concerns you greatly, King of Gondor. Despite every instinct screaming danger, Aragorn found himself leaning forward. What vision? Your city burning, Angamate said with relish. Your people fleeing in terror before a darkness that rises not from Mordor, but from the deep places of the earth. The Balrogs wake, the dragons stir, and from the far south comes an army such as the world has not seen since the elder days. All this have I seen in the stone, and all this shall come to pass, unless what? Aragorn asked, though he dreaded the answer. Unless you accept our new master's offer. Release us from Isildur's curse, yes, but bind us instead to your service. Command the fleet of sorrows as your ancestors commanded the ships of Numenor. Grant us new purpose, new honor, and in return, we shall be your shield against the darkness that comes. Refuse and face the future alone, with only mortal ships and mortal courage to guard against immortal evil. The offer hung in the air like poison, tempting and terrible in equal measure, and in the silence that followed, all could hear it, a sound like distant thunder, growing ever closer, as if the very foundations of the world were beginning to crack. The choice before the King of Gondor would determine not merely the fate of the Black Fleet, but the survival of all Middle-earth. King Elisar sat motionless upon his throne, the terrible weight of choice pressing down upon him like the burden of the ring itself. Around him, the hall had fallen into a silence so deep that the sound of his own heartbeat seemed to echo from the stone wall. Before him stood two figures that embodied the extremes of possibility. Farazir seeking redemption through death, Angamate offering power through continued bondage to darkness. Show me, the king said at last, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. If you would have me believe these visions of doom, then show me what your master's stone revealed. Angamate smiled, expression that held no warmth. Gladly, son of Arathorn, but know this. Once you have looked into the depths of the eighth Palantir, you cannot close your eyes to what it shows. The visions will follow you into sleep and waking, into battle and counsel, until all is fulfilled or all is lost. I am not afraid, Aragorn replied, though his hand instinctively tightened on Anduril's hilt. The corrupted admiral raised the black crystal, and its surface began to pulse with a light that seemed to come from within. Not the clear radiance of the true stones, but something oily and wrong, like the glow of phosphorescence on a rotting shore. As Aragorn gazed into its depths, the world around him faded away, replaced by visions that struck him like physical blows. He saw Minas Tirith wrapped in flames that burned black rather than red, its white walls cracking like eggshells before the assault of creatures that belonged to nightmare. Great worms burst from the earth, their hide tough as dragon scale, while from the sky descended things with wings like night itself. In the harbor, honest ships burned and sank, while their crews screamed for mercy that would never come. But worse than the destruction was what he saw in the faces of the defenders. Not merely fear, but the hopeless recognition that they faced an enemy beyond their power to resist. He watched Faramir fall beneath the claws of something that had once been human, saw Imrahil's ship torn apart by tentacles that rose from waters black as ink. In the citadel itself, the white tree withered and died as shadows consumed the very light. Then the vision shifted, showing him the source of this devastation. From caverns beneath the mountains came the ancient servants of Morgoth, Balrogs wrapped in shadow and flame, their whips cracking like thunder. From the deepest places of the sea rose krakens whose tentacles could crush a castle, while from the far south marched armies of trolls and orcs, led by creatures whose names had been forgotten since the elder days. "Enough!" Aragorn gasped, tearing his gaze from the stone. The visions lingered, burned into his mind like brands, and he could feel their poison spreading through his thoughts. "You have seen but a fraction," Angamate said, lowering the palantir. "The powers we serve are patient. They have waited since the music of creation for their chance to reshape the world according to their will. Sauron was merely their instrument, a tool to be discarded when his usefulness ended. Now they move more directly, and mortal armies cannot stand against them." Farazir stepped forward, his face filled with anguish. "My king, I beg you, do not listen to his words. I have seen what our masters are capable of, felt the weight of their malice pressing down upon the world like a mountain. To serve them is to become less than human, to be hollow shells filled only with their hunger and hate." "And yet," Angamate countered, "what choice do you offer him, noble Farazir? Death for us, and for him the certainty of defeat when the true enemy reveals itself. At least my path offers hope. Dark hope, perhaps, but hope nonetheless." King Elisar rose from his throne, Andúril still naked in his hand. The blade seemed to shine with its own light in the presence of such evil, and where its radiance touched the black palantir, the stone hissed and steamed as if in pain. "There is another choice," he said quietly, "one that neither of you has considered. Perhaps because you have lived so long in darkness that you have forgotten what light can accomplish." Both admirals stared at him, confusion plain on their faces. "The curse of Isildur binds you to wandering until forgiveness is granted, or the world ends," Aragorn continued. "But there is a third condition, that you prove yourselves worthy of redemption through service to the light, not to the powers of darkness that have corrupted you, not even to me as King of Gondor, but to the cause of all that is good and fair in Middle-earth." "Impossible," Angamate scoffed. "We are bound by oaths older and stronger than any king's command. The Black Oath cannot be broken, only transferred to a new master." "Cannot it?" Aragorn asked, raising Andúril until its point touched the corrupted palantir. Where the blade met the crystal, light blazed forth. Not the harsh radiance of the sun, but something gentler and more profound, like starlight concentrated to diamond brightness. "You forget, Lord Admiral, that I am not merely King of Gondor. I bear the blood of Númenor, yes, but also that of the elves through Elrond's line. And more than this, I have walked paths that few mortals tread, spoken with powers that govern the fate of all who dwell beneath the stars." The black stone began to crack under Andúril's touch, and from the fissures seeped a darkness so thick it seemed almost solid. But the blade's light held it back, containing the corruption even as it consumed the crystal from within. "The power that bound you to the Black Oath was great," Aragorn said, his voice carrying the authority not just of kingship, but of one who had faced the very gates of death and returned. "But it was not the greatest power in Arda. There are forces of light that can break any chain, heal any wound, redeem any soul, if that soul truly wishes to be redeemed." The palantir shattered with a sound like the cry of a dying dragon, and from its ruins rose shadows that writhed and reached toward the assembled company with grasping tendril. But Andúril's light drove them back, banishing them into whatever void had spawned them. Angamate screamed, a sound of pure agony that spoke of bonds being torn asunder and oaths being broken by force. He collapsed to his knees, his perfect features cracking like a mask, revealing something beneath that was neither human nor wholly inhuman, but caught somewhere between the two. Farazir, meanwhile, fell forward, as if released from chains he had carried for so long he had forgotten their weight. When he looked up, tears of salt water streamed down his face, the first tears he had shed in 3,000 years. "The binding is broken," he whispered. "I can feel it. The Black Oath holds no power over us now. But how?" "Because," Aragorn said, lowering his sword but keeping it ready, "you chose to speak truth over lies, to seek redemption over continued bondage. That choice, freely made, was enough to crack the foundation of your curse. The rest was merely a matter of applying the proper force. But even as he spoke, a new sound reached their ears, the boom of great drums echoing across the water from the direction of the harbor. Through the windows of the hall, they could see the black ships stirring, their crews no longer bound to stillness. Whether they would prove friend or foe remained to be seen. The first phase of the great test was complete, but the true trial was only just beginning. The drums that echoed across the harbor of Minas Tirith were not the drums of war, but something far more ominous, the rhythm of decision, of a fleet awakening to the knowledge that their long bondage had been broken. From the windows of the throne hall, King Elisar and his council watched as the 27 black ships began to move, their crews stirring to life after centuries of supernatural slumber. "They know," Farazar said, rising unsteadily to his feet. "Every soul in the fleet can feel what has transpired here. The breaking of the Palantir has severed their connection to the masters we served, but it has not answered the question of what they will choose to do with their newfound freedom." Siti. On the floor where Angamate had fallen, only empty robes remained. Whatever force sustained his twisted existence had departed with the destruction of the corrupted Seeing Stone. But his words still echoed in the hall, his promises and threats hanging in the air like smoke from a doused fire. Prince Imrahil pointed toward the harbor mouth. "Look there. The ships are separating. Some move toward the open sea, while others approach the quays." Indeed, the great fleet was dividing itself. 13 vessels, led by a massive war dromond with sides black as midnight, were turning away from the harbor, their sails filling with wind that seemed to come from no earthly quarter. But 14 ships, including the great Alcarandas, were moving slowly toward the docks of Minas Tirith, their crews visible now upon the decks, pale figures in ancient armor, but no longer moving with the mechanical precision of the cursed. "Those who flee," Faramir observed, "they make for the southern seas. Perhaps they seek to escape the consequences of their long service to darkness." "And those who come toward us?" Aragorn asked, though his eyes were fixed on Farazir's face. The former admiral's expression was troubled. "The fleet was never united in its service to the shadow, my king. Some embraced the darkness willingly, finding in it a purpose that their exile had denied them. Others served only because the bonds compelled them, counting each evil deed as another mark against their soul. It seems that the breaking of the curse has allowed each crew to choose its own path." A new messenger arrived, this one bearing the colors of the harbor guard. "Sire," he said, breathing hard from his swift journey, "the ships that approach. They fly the signal flags requesting permission to dock. Their lead vessel sends word that they seek parley under the white banner." Aragorn considered this for a moment, weighing the risks against the possibility. "Tell the harbor master to grant them berths at the outer docks, but let them land no more than a score of their number at any time. Station archers upon the quay, and have the guard ready for any treachery. Yet, treat them with the courtesy due to former enemies who seek to make amends." As the messenger departed, Imrahil voiced the concern that all were thinking. "Can we trust them, my lord? They have served the darkness for 3 millennia. How can we know that this is not another deception?" "We cannot," Aragorn admitted, "but consider this. They had no need to seek parley if their intentions were hostile. With their ancient power and knowledge of the sea, they could have struck from the water without warning. The very fact that they come openly suggests that at least some among them truly seek redemption." Farazir nodded slowly. "There are good men among my crews, Your Majesty, men who kept their honor intact despite the corruption that surrounded them. Captain Mithrellas of the Wind Rider, Admiral Círdan of the Star Foam. They never forgot what we once were, never stopped hoping that someday we might be worthy again of the light we had lost." "And what of those who fled south?" Faramir asked. "Should we not pursue them before they can gather strength or seek new masters?" "Let them go," Aragorn said, after a moment's thought. "They have made their choice, as is their right now that the bonds are broken. But send swift messengers to all our allies, to the Rohirrim, to Lothlorien, to the Grey Haven. Let them know that ships of darkness sail the southern waters, and that vigilance is needed. The next hours passed in tense preparation. The 14 ships that had chosen to approach Minas Tirith docked without incident, their crews maintaining perfect discipline as they secured their vessels and prepared for what might be their final judgment. No weapons were drawn, no threats issued, yet their very presence filled the harbor with an atmosphere of otherworldly dread. As evening fell, a delegation came ashore under the sign of the White Banner. They were led by a tall woman whose beauty bore the unmistakable stamp of Númenórean nobility, though her skin had the pale translucence of one who had dwelt long beneath the wave. Behind her walked captains and admirals whose names were inscribed in the most ancient chronicles of the sea. They were brought to a lesser hall of the citadel, where King Elisar waited with a reduced council, for he judged it wise not to show either too much trust or too much fear. Farazir stood at his side, having accepted the role of interpreter between the living and those who existed in the twilight between life and death. The woman approached the throne with the fluid grace of a dancer, yet her eyes held the weight of centuries. When she spoke, her voice was like the sound of wind across deep water. I am Mithrelas, called the Sea Daughter, captain of the Wind Rider, and speaker for those who have chosen the path of possible redemption. We come before you, Elisar King, not to plead for mercy we do not deserve, but to offer service in whatever form you deem fitting. We have been the servants of darkness for longer than your kingdom has existed. If it pleases you, let us be servants of the light for whatever time remains to us. What service could you offer? Aragorn asked carefully. That would outweigh 3 millennia of evil done in shadow. The service of knowledge, first and foremost, she replied. We have sailed every sea, walked shores that exist on no map made by mortal hands. We know the secret places where the remnants of ancient evil still hide, the paths by which dark powers might yet strike at the lands of the free. This knowledge we offer freely, asking nothing in return save the chance to cleanse our soul through honest deed. Admiral Círdan, a figure whose beard had grown white with age despite his preserved state, stepped forward. There is more, Your Majesty. The 13 ships that fled southward, they go not to escape justice, but to serve masters who are older and more terrible than Sauron ever was. Powers stir in the deep places of the world, things that were bound by the music of creation, but may soon break free. The fleet that remains with Angamate's faction will serve as their vanguard when the time comes. A chill ran through the assembled council at these words. Faramir leaned forward. You speak of threats that the corrupted Palantir showed us. How real is this danger? Real as the stone beneath your feet, Mithrelas replied grimly. The war against the darkness did not end with Sauron's fall. It merely entered a new phase. And in that war, you will need allies who understand the nature of your enemies, who have walked in shadow and know its way. Aragorn studied the faces before him, seeing in them the reflection of his own struggle with the weight of kingship and the burden of choice. If I were to accept your service, he said slowly, what assurance could you give that you would not betray that trust as you betrayed it before? None. Mithrelas answered with startling honesty. We are what we are, fallen beings seeking redemption through deed rather than word. Judge us not by our promises, but by our actions. Set us such tasks as will test our resolve, and if we fail, then cast us into the sea to find whatever rest awaits the irredeemable. The king was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy. Then, this shall be your first trial. Sail north to the Grey Haven, and place yourselves under the command of Círdan the shipwright. He alone among the wise has authority over all who travel the western waters. If he deems you worthy of trust, then you shall have my ear when next we meet. If not, he left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning was clear. Mithrelas bowed deeply. It shall be as you command, Elisar King. We go to face the judgment of the oldest mariner in Middle-earth, knowing that our fate hangs in the balance. Yet for the first time in 3,000 years, we go with hope rather than despair in our hearts. As the delegation departed to carry word to their ships, Farazir remained behind, his face thoughtful. "You have chosen wisely, my king," he said. "Círdan will see through any deception, but he will also recognize genuine repentance when it stands before him. If they pass his test, they will be worthy allies indeed. And if they fail," Aragorn asked, "then they will have found the peace they sought." Farazar replied, "For Círdan has the power to grant the death that has been denied them, to send their souls at last into whatever lies beyond the circles of the world." Outside, the drums of the Black Fleet had fallen silent, but the wind from the sea carried new sounds, the creak of rigging and the splash of oars as 14 ships prepared to sail toward whatever destiny awaited them at the Grey Haven. The first phase of their trial was complete, but the true test of their redemption lay ahead. In the deepest chambers of Minas Tirith, King Elessar stood long in thought, knowing that he had set in motion events whose consequences would echo through the ages. The shadow of the past had touched the present, and only time would tell whether it brought doom or deliverance. The Grey Havens had seen many partings in their long history: the departure of the ring-bearers, the sailing of the last Noldor to the undying lands, the gentle passage of those who had grown weary of Middle-earth and sought the peace of the West. But never before had Círdan the shipwright watched 14 black ships approach his harbors under flags of truce, their crews seeking judgment rather than passage. From his tower overlooking the Gulf of Lune, the ancient elf lord stood silent as carved stone, his gray eyes fixed upon the approaching fleet. Beside him waited Galdor of the Havens and Eärendil, the last of the Noldoran mariners, their faces reflecting the same mixture of wonder and wariness that filled their lord's heart. "They come as King Elessar commanded," Galdor observed, reading the signal flags that flew from the lead ship's mast. "But I confess, my lord, that I had never thought to see the day when the lost fleet of Númenor would seek harbor at the Grey Haven." Círdan nodded slowly, his ancient mind working through possibilities and probabilities that stretched back to the elder days. "I knew Elros Tar Minyatar when he was yet young," he said quietly. "I sailed with his people in their days of glory, and I mourned when pride and folly led them to their doom. If these are truly the remnant of that great race, then their coming here is fraught with meaning beyond our easy understanding." The first of the black ships was entering the harbor now, its oars moving with perfect precision despite the otherworldly appearance of its crew. The vessel itself was a thing of terrible beauty, sleek as a dolphin, yet vast as a floating palace, its black hull adorned with silver inlay that caught the light like stars upon dark water. At its prow stood a figure whose nobility was evident even at distance, her sea-green cloak billowing in the wind. As the ship drew alongside the longest quay, Círdan and his companions descended from the tower to meet their unexpected guest. The ancient elf moved with the same unhurried grace that had marked him since the awakening of the elves, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his bearing. For this was a meeting that would test wisdom accumulated over 7,000 years. Mithrelas was the first to step onto the quay, followed by a dozen of her captains. They moved with the fluid precision of those long accustomed to shipboard life, yet their feet seemed to barely touch the stone. As one, they knelt before Círdan, their heads bowed in the ancient gesture of supplication. "Rise, children of Númenor," the shipwright said, his voice carrying the music of distant shores. "Too long have your knees bent to unworthy masters. Stand now in the light of Eärendil's star, and speak your purpose in coming to these hallowed waters." Mithrelas rose gracefully, her pale eyes meeting Círdan's gaze without flinching. "My lord Círdan, whose ships first bore the Eldar from Middle-earth to the Blessed Realm, we come as petitioners seeking not passage but judgment. We have sailed long in shadow, serving powers that sought only destruction and despair. Now, freed from those bonds by the mercy of King Elessar, we seek to prove ourselves worthy of redemption through service to the light." The shipwright studied her face, seeing there the noble features of the Star-Kindler's line, but marked now with the weariness of ages and the weight of accumulated guilt. "Tell me, Captain Mithrelas, for I remember that name from the rolls of honor in Númenor's greatest days, what kept the spark of good alive in your heart through all the long years of bondage. Memory, my lord, she replied simply. Memory of what we once were, of the light we once served. Even in our darkest hour, when the black oath compelled us to deeds that our souls abhorred, we remembered Numenor as it was in its golden age, the white ships sailing under the light of the two trees' kindred, the just laws of the king, the wisdom shared between elf and man. That memory became our anchor, preventing us from falling into complete corruption. Captain Tar Aldarian, whose name bore the memory of the great Sea King, stepped forward. We do not ask for forgiveness, Lord Círdan, for we know that 3 millennia of evil cannot be washed away by words. We ask only for the chance to spend whatever time remains to us in service to those we have wronged. Círdan was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from face to face among the assembled captains. In each, he saw the same mixture of hope and despair, the same desperate hunger for redemption that had driven them across perilous seas to stand before his judgment. Walk with, he said at last, turning toward the harbor's edge, where the waves lapped gently against the stone. Let us speak of things that were and are and yet may be. They walked in silence for a time, the ancient elf and the sea captain who was neither living nor dead, while behind them the 14 black ships rode at anchor like sleeping leviathans. The afternoon sun slanted across the water, painting everything in shades of gold and silver, and for a moment it seemed as if the peace of the elder days had returned to Middle-earth. You speak of memory, Círdan said at length, but memory alone does not sustain the soul through such trials as you have endured. What else kept you from falling into the complete darkness that claimed your companions who fled south? Mithralis was quiet for several steps before answering. Love, my lord. Love for what we had lost, for what we might yet preserve. Many of us had families in Numenor, children, spouses, parents who perished in the downfall. Their memory became a sacred trust, a reminder of the lives that depended upon our choices. Even when the dark powers commanded us to evil, we tried to find ways to limit the harm, to preserve what innocence we could. And yet, Círdan observed gently, harm was done, ships were sunk, lives were lost, families destroyed by your actions, however reluctant they may have been. Yes, Mithralis said, and the word carried the weight of 3,000 years of grief. That is the burden we bear, the debt we can never fully repay. We can only try to tip the balance toward light in whatever time remains to us. They had reached the end of the quay now, where the waters of Lune met the sea. Círdan stood looking westward, toward the distant shores that only the elves might reach, his ancient face troubled with thought. The matter before me is not simple, he said at last. I have the power to grant you the death you seek, to send your souls beyond the circles of the world, where they might find whatever peace awaits the repentant. But I also have the wisdom to see that dark times are coming, when the free peoples will need every ally they can find. He turned to face her fully, and in his eyes Mithralis saw depths older than the foundations of Numenor itself. Can you swear to me, by whatever you hold most sacred, that you will never again serve the powers of darkness, no matter what trials may come? I swear it, she said without hesitation, by the memory of the white tree, by the light of Arundel's star, by the love I bore for those who died in Numenor's fall. I swear it for myself and for all who follow me, that we will serve the light until our final breath, even should that service lead us into the very depths of doom. Círdan nodded slowly. Then this is my judgment. You shall remain in my service for a full year, that I might observe your deeds and test your resolve. You will sail where I command, fight whom I designate as enemies, protect those I deem worthy of protection. If, at the end of that year, you have proven yourselves trustworthy, I will send word to King Elisar that you are fit to serve the cause of the free people. If not, he did not finish the sentence, but its meaning was clear. We accept your judgment gladly, Lord Círdan, Mithralis said, bowing once more. What would you have us do first? The shipwright's eyes turned southward, toward waters that had grown dark with more than mere storm cloud. There are ships missing from the merchant routes. 7 vessels that should have reached Dol Amroth by now, but have vanished without trace. I suspect they have fallen prey to those of your former companion who chose the path of continued darkness. Find them if they yet live. Avenge them if they do not. Show me that the children of Numenor can still protect the innocent instead of preying upon them. As night fell over the Grey Havens, 14 black ships prepared once more for sea, their crews working with renewed purpose. They sailed not as servants of shadow, but as seekers of redemption, carrying with them the hope that even the deepest stains might yet be washed clean by deeds of valor and sacrifice. Behind them, Círdan watched from his tower, his ancient heart heavy with the weight of the choice he had made. Only time would tell whether mercy or justice would prove the wiser path. 3 weeks after departing the Grey Haven, the autumn seas off the coast of Belfalis ran dark beneath storm clouds that seemed to follow the wind's own counsel, gathering and dispersing without regard for the natural order of weather. Captain Mithrelas stood upon the deck of the Wind Rider, her pale eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the missing merchant vessels that had vanished in these waters. Behind her, spread across the choppy seas in a formation perfected over millennia of naval warfare, the 13 other ships of her redeemed fleet moved through the swells like hunting wolves. Each crew worked with grim purpose, knowing that their first test under Círdan's judgment might well determine whether they found redemption or destruction. "Captain," called Nimrodel from her position at the bow, "the seabirds flee westward, and the water grows foul ahead. We approach something that nature abhors." Mithrelas moved forward to join her lieutenant, noting the same signs that had served them well in their long years of wandering. The sea itself seemed to recoil from whatever lay ahead, its waves taking on the oily sheen that spoke of supernatural corruption. Even the wind carried a taint, not the clean salt smell of honest ocean, but something that reminded her unpleasantly of the waters near Umbar in the days of their dark service. "Signal the fleet," she commanded. "Battle formation, but weapons sheathed. We seek answers before we seek blood." The flags ran up the mast, and across the water the other black ships adjusted their positions with fluid precision. Whatever else their long exile had cost them, it had not diminished their seamanship or their ability to work as a unified force. As they crested the next line of swells, the source of the corruption became clear. Ahead lay a sight that chilled even hearts long accustomed to horror. A ship graveyard where 7 merchant vessels lay broken and burning, their hulls torn open as if by gigantic claws. Around the wreckage circled 3 of the black ships that had fled Minas Tirith, their crews visible as dark shapes against their pale sails. The Sea Serpent, the Doombringer, and the Black Gulf, Nimrodel identified grimly. "I know those ships well. They were among the most eager servants of our former master." But it was not merely the presence of their former companions that troubled Mithrelas. Between the burning merchant ships moved shapes in the water, vast and sinuous, too large to be any natural creature of the sea. As she watched, one of them breached the surface briefly, revealing a hide that gleamed like black steel and eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence. "Sea drakes," she breathed. "The dark powers have awakened the monsters of the deep." The creatures were ancient beyond mortal reckoning, servants of Morgoth himself in the elder days, bound beneath the waves when the world was young. That they swam free now spoke of bonds being broken and powers stirring that should have remained sleeping until the world's end. A horn sounded from the Sea Serpent, and the 3 enemy vessels began to move toward Mithrelas's fleet, their intent clearly hostile. At the same time, the sea drakes turned their massive heads toward the newcomers, their serpentine necks rising from the water like the pillars of some underwater cathedral. "They mean to test us," Mithrelas said, her hand moving to the ancient sword at her side, "to see if we will fight for the light as fiercely as we once fought for the darkness." She raised her voice, calling across the water in the ancient battle tongue of Numenor. "Captains of the redeemed fleet, we face our past made manifest, ships that chose the dark path, and creatures that serve the ancient evil. Let this be our proof before Lord Círdan that we have truly turned from shadow to light, for the memory of Numenor as it should have been. The answering war cries that arose from 13 throats echoed across the water like thunder, and suddenly the air was full of action. The black ships of the redeemed fleet surged forward, their crews working with the desperate efficiency of those who knew that failure meant not merely death, but the loss of their only chance for redemption. The battle that followed was unlike any seen in the waters of Middle-earth since the Elder Days. Ship fought against ship with arts of seamanship learned in the workshops of the Star-Kindler himself, while beneath the wave, the sea drakes struck with tentacles and fangs that could crush stone. The water ran red with blood, both mortal and immortal, and the clash of steel on steel rang out like the hammers of Auli in his smithy. Mithrelas found herself locked in single combat with Captain Ulfast of the Sea Serpent, a mariner she had once counted as friend in the days before corruption claimed them all. Their blades met and parted in the ancient patterns of Numenorian swordplay, each strike carrying the weight of 3 millennia of shared history. "Why do you fight us, sister?" Ulfast called out, as their swords locked at the hilts. "We serve the same masters we always have, only now they offer us greater rewards for our service." "Because I remember what we were before we fell," Mithrelas replied, breaking the lock and stepping back. "We were the children of Arendil, the guardians of the light upon the waters. That is what I choose to be again, whatever the cost." "Then you choose death," Ulfast snarled, launching a series of attacks that would have overwhelmed any lesser swordsman. But Mithrelas had learned her blade work in the courts of Armenelos, and 3,000 years of battle had only honed her skills. She parried, riposted, and struck with the fluid grace of water itself, until Ulfast's blade lay broken at his feet, and her point rested at his throat. "Choose," she said quietly. "Surrender and accept Círdan's judgment, or find whatever peace awaits you in the depths." Around them, the battle was turning in favor of the redeemed fleet. 2 of the enemy ships had been taken, their crews either captured or fled into the sea. The third was burning, its captain preferring destruction to surrender. Of the sea drakes, one lay dead in the water while the others had withdrawn to the deeper channels, their taste for battle clearly diminished. Ulfast looked into her eyes and saw there the same determination that had once driven Numenor's ships to the edges of the world. Slowly, he let his remaining weapon fall to the deck. "I surrender," he said quietly, "not to you, but to the memory of what we once were." As the sun set over the scene of battle, Mithrelas stood among the rescued survivors of the merchant vessels, men and women whose lives had hung in the balance, while ancient powers played out their eternal game of light and shadow. Their gratitude was evident in their faces, but it was the respect she saw there that mattered more. They looked upon her not as a creature of darkness, but as a protector, a guardian of the innocent against the forces that would devour them. "Signal Lord Círdan," she commanded. "Tell him that the missing ships have been found, their crews rescued, and their attackers defeated. Tell him also that we offer him 3 prizes, 2 ships taken in battle, and 12 of our former companions who have chosen to seek redemption rather than continued service to the dark." As the flags ran up the mast, carrying word of victory to the Grey Havens, Mithrelas allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The first test had been passed, but she knew that greater trials lay ahead. The awakening of the sea drakes spoke of powers stirring that dwarfed even the malice of Sauron, and the redeemed fleet would need to prove itself again and again before their path to redemption was complete. But for the first time in 3,000 years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope that the future might hold light instead of shadow, redemption instead of damnation. The hunt in southern waters was complete, but the greater hunt for absolution had only just begun. 6 months after the Battle of the Merchant Fleet, in the deep places of the world, beneath trenches that no sunlight had ever touched, something vast and ancient stirred in its millennial slumber. The vibrations of surface battles, the breaking of old oaths, and the awakening of forces long bound had reached even these uttermost depths. In chambers carved from the bones of the earth itself, Creatures that predated the very concept of light began to stretch limbs that could span valleys. Captain Mithrelas felt the tremor before she saw its effects, a shuddering in the Wind Rider's hull that spoke of movements in the deepest places of the sea. Around her, the mixed fleet of redeemed Númenórean vessels and Círdan's own ships rode the swells off the Cape of Andrast, their crews engaged in what should have been a routine patrol of the southern shipping lane. It was young Tarmanelder who first spotted the sign that turned routine into catastrophe. "Captain!" he called from the crow's nest, his voice carrying a note of terror that made every sailor on deck look up. "The water ahead. It rises without wind or tide." Mithrelas raised her far sight and felt her undead heart would have stopped if it still beat. A league ahead, the sea was indeed rising, bulging upward, as if some impossible mass were ascending from the deepest trenches. The water darkened as it rose, taking on the black-green hue of ocean floors that had never known the touch of sunlight. "Signal all ships," she commanded, her voice cutting through the sudden babble of frightened voices. "Emergency ascent protocol. Whatever comes from those depths, we meet it in formation, not scattered like fish before the net." The flags ran up the mast, and across the water 14 ships began to move with the coordination born of centuries sailing together. But even as they maneuvered, the bulge in the sea grew larger, and from its center emerged something that belonged to the world's earliest nightmares. It was a tentacle, but tentacle was too small a word for the appendage that broke the surface with a sound like thunder. Thick as the Tower of Orthanc, and longer than the largest ship, it rose from the depths, trailing water that steamed in the sunlight. Its surface was covered in scales that gleamed like black pearls, and along its length ran suckers large enough to engulf a house. "Kraken," breathed Nimrodel, her face pale even by the standards of their undead crew. But not merely any kraken. This is Umbar, the Devourer, the greatest of Morgoth's sea spawn. It was bound beneath the sundering sea when the world was bent. More tentacles were emerging now, each one vast beyond imagining, and between them rose a head that could have served as the foundation for a fortress. Eyes like burning coals gazed malevolently across the waves, older than the elves, hungrier than the dragons, filled with a hatred that predated the very existence of the sun and moon. From Círdan's ship, the Gilgalad, came signal flags spelling out orders in the ancient marine tongue. "All vessels, maintain distance. Do not engage until nature of threat is fully assessed." But Umbar had no intention of allowing such careful deliberation. With a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the sea, the creature began to move toward the assembled fleet, its massive bulk creating waves that threatened to swamp smaller vessels. Wherever its tentacles touched the water, corruption spread. Fish floated dead to the surface, and the sea itself seemed to recoil from the ancient evil. "Lord Círdan seeks to understand what we face," Mithrelas called to her crew, "but understanding may come too late. Remember our oath to protect the innocent and serve the light. Whatever this creature intends, it means death for every sailor on these waters." She raised her sword, the blade that had been forged in Númenor's greatest days, and its steel caught the sunlight like captured starfire. Around her, the crew of the Wind Rider prepared for battle with the grim efficiency of those who had learned that death held no terror when one's cause was just. The first tentacle struck like an avalanche made of living flesh, crashing down where the Wind Rider had been moments before. Only Mithrelas's preternatural reflexes had allowed her to steer clear, and even so, the wash from the impact nearly capsized the ancient vessel. "Port! Battery! Fire!" she commanded, and the ship's side erupted in thunder as 24 cannons spoke at once. The shot struck Umagor's hide and bounced off like pebbles against castle walls. The creature's armor had been forged in the music of creation itself, hardened by ages of pressure beneath the deepest seas. Mortal weapons, it seemed, could do it no harm, but the attack had at least gained the monster's attention. With a hiss like steam from the earth's core, it turned its burning gaze upon the Wind Rider and began to move toward them with frightening speed. All ships, came Círdan's voice across the water, amplified by arts learned in Valinor itself. The creature is beyond our power to destroy, but it is not beyond our power to bind. Form the starlight pattern. We attempt the great binding. Mithrelis felt her heart leap with something that might have been hope. The great binding was a technique from the elder days, used by Gil-galad himself to contain the servants of Morgoth when they could not be destroyed outright. But it required perfect coordination between every ship in the fleet, and one mistake would mean death for them all. "You heard Lord Círdan," she called to her crew. "Form the starlight pattern and pray to whatever powers still watch over the children of Númenor that we remember the ancient ways truly." What followed was a dance of ships that belonged more to legend than to any mortal sea battle. 14 vessels moved in patterns that traced the shape of stars upon the water, their courses calculated to channel the very forces of creation itself. Each captain had to hold his position precisely. Each crew had to work with flawless timing, for the slightest error would break the pattern and release forces that could tear apart both fleet and monster. Umagor seemed to sense what they attempted, for its attacks became more frenzied. Tentacles lashed out with the force of falling mountain, creating water spouts that reached toward the clouds. But the ships danced between them, guided by seamanship that married elvish wisdom with Númenorian pride, human courage with the desperate hope of the redeemed. Slowly, impossibly, the pattern began to take effect. Lines of light appeared in the water between the ships. Not visible light, but something deeper, the fundamental force that held the music of creation together. These lines began to tighten around Umagor like a net of pure order, constraining its chaotic malevolence. The creature's roars shook the very sky as it felt the binding take hold. It thrashed with the fury of a living hurricane, sending waves as tall as towers crashing in all directions. But the pattern held, sustained by the combined will of elf and mortal, living and undead, all united in the desperate need to contain this ancient evil. "Now!" cried Círdan's voice. "Complete the binding. Send it back to the depths where it belongs." Siki. The final phase of the great binding required something that none but the redeemed fleet could provide: the willing sacrifice of their own supernatural preservation. For 3,000 years, dark arts had sustained their existence beyond the natural span of mortal life. Now they poured that stolen time into the binding, using their own cursed existence as the final strand in the net that would drag Umagor back to the depth. One by one, the crew of each black ship felt their unnatural vitality draining away. They aged years in moments, their preserved forms showing the true toll of their long exile. Some crumbled to dust, even as they held their position, but their dying hands never left the rigging. Their final breaths still shaped words of command. Mithrelis felt her own strength ebbing as the binding drew upon her essence, but she also felt something else, a lightness, as if a weight she had carried for millennia was finally being lifted from her shoulders. This was not death, she realized, but transformation. They were trading their cursed immortality for something far more precious, the chance to die as heroes rather than as the servants of shadow. With a final roar that seemed to split the very sky, Umagor was pulled down into the depths, bound by chains forged from starlight and sacrifice. The waters closed over its massive form, and slowly, gradually, the sea began to return to its natural state. Of the 14 ships that had fought in the battle, only 7 remained afloat. The others had paid the ultimate price for the binding, their crews finding at last the peace that had been denied them for so long. But those who survived found that they were changed, no longer the pale shadows of their former selves, but something new, something reborn. "It is finished," Erden said, as his ship drew alongside the battered Windrider. "The ancient evil is bound, and you have proven beyond all doubt that redemption is possible even for the most fallen of soul." Mithrelis looked down at her hand and saw that they were no longer pale as pearl, but held the warm flush of living blood. Around her, the surviving members of her crew showed the same transformation. They lived again, truly lived, purchased by their willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of others. "What happens now, my lord?" she asked. "Now," Círdan smiled, "you return to King Elisar with the proof of your redemption written in deeds rather than words. The binding will hold Umagor for an aid, but other threats stir in the deep places. Middle-earth will have need of ships and sailors who understand both the light and the shadow." As the 7 remaining ships turned toward the north and home, their crews felt something they had not experienced in 3,000 years, the simple joy of being alive. They had been tested in the crucible of battle, and emerged not as the cursed remnant of a fallen kingdom, but as the first hope for a future where even the darkest stains might be washed clean. Behind them, the sea lay calm under the setting sun, but in its depths, ancient powers turned restlessly in their sleep, and the final trial of the redeemed fleet was yet to come. 1 year after the binding of Umagor, the great harbor of Minas Tirith had never welcomed such a fleet as the one that approached its white quays on the first day of spring. 7 ships sailed under the banners of both Gondor and the Grey Havens, their hulls no longer the ominous black of their cursed years, but gleaming white as the foam on breaking waves. At their head sailed the Wind Rider, her captain standing proud at the prow, alive once more and bearing news that would reshape the understanding of all who dwelt by the sea. King Elisar stood upon the harbor wall with his full court arrayed beside him, watching the approach of vessels that embodied the most unlikely redemption in the history of Middle-earth. Beside him, Faramir held a scroll bearing Círdan's own seal, its contents known only to the king himself. "A year ago," Aragorn said quietly, "I sent them to face the judgment of the wisest mariner in Middle-earth, not truly knowing if I would ever see them again. Now they return transformed, no longer the wraiths of Númenor's pride, but living proof that even the deepest darkness can be overcome." The Wind Rider drew alongside the royal quay, and Captain Mithrelus stepped onto the stone with the fluid grace of one born to the sea. But where once her beauty had been terrible in its otherworldly perfection, now it held the warm vitality of mortal life restored. Behind her came the surviving captains of the redeemed fleet, Tar Aldarion, Nimrodel, Tar Meneldur, and others whose names had been inscribed in shadow but were now written in light. "Your Majesty," Mithrelus said, offering the deep bow due to a king, "we return to you as Círdan commanded, our year of service complete, and our worthiness proven in battle against the ancient darkness." "Rise, Captain," Aragorn replied, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "You come not as petitioners, but as proven allies. Lord Círdan's message tells of deeds that will be remembered as long as the sea kisses the shore. The binding of Umagor, the cleansing of the southern shipping lanes, the rescue of 17 merchant crews. These are the acts of heroes, not of cursed exiles." Mithrelus straightened, and in her eyes Aragorn saw something he had not expected: peace. The torment that had marked her features a year before was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of one who had found their proper place in the world's great pattern. "We have paid our debts as best we could, Your Majesty," she said. "But more than that, we have discovered something that 3,000 years of wandering could not teach us, that redemption comes not from forgetting our crime, but from choosing each day to be worthy of the lives we failed to protect in our service to darkness." Prince Imrahil stepped forward, his sea cloak bright in the morning sun. "The question now is what place you will take in the days to come. Círdan writes that dark powers still stir in the deep places, that the binding of one great evil has only delayed the awakening of others. Will you sail under Gondor's banner when that awakening comes?" "We will sail where honor calls us," Tar Aldarion replied. "But if I may speak freely, Your Majesty, there is a matter of greater import than our own service. In our year with Lord Círdan, we learned much of the ancient lore, and we discovered something that threatens more than just the shipping lanes." Aragorn felt a familiar chill, the same sensation that had warned him of danger throughout his long years as a ranger. "Speak plainly, Captain." Tar Eldarion glanced at Mithrelas, who nodded encouragement. The 13 ships that fled from Minas Tirith a year ago, they did not simply seek new masters to serve. They sailed to the uttermost south, beyond the maps of any mortal cartographer, to a place where the sea meets the foundations of the world itself. There they found something that has been waiting since the music of creation, for its chance to remake the world according to its own dark vision. The unnamed deep, Nimrodel added, her voice barely above a whisper. Círdan showed us the ancient charts, the ones that date from before the bending of the world. In the farthest south, where the great ice meets the sea, there is a place marked only with the symbol of warning, a place where even the Valar fear to look. Faramir's scholarly mind leaped to the implications. You're saying that our enemies seek to wake whatever lies in that place? More than that, Mithrelas said grimly. They have succeeded. 3 weeks ago, our scouts reported massive disturbances in the far southern seas. Waves higher than mountains, storms that blew against the wind, and beneath it all, a sound like the breathing of something vast beyond imagining. The unnamed deep stirs, and when it wakes fully, it will make the cataclysm that destroyed Númenor seem like a gentle rain. The harbor fell silent, save for the lapping of waves against stone. Every man and woman present understood the magnitude of what they were hearing, a threat that dwarfed even the power of Sauron at his height. "What would you counsel, Captain?" Aragorn asked quietly. "You know the sea and its perils better than any living soul." Mithrelas was quiet for a long moment, her gaze turning southward toward waters that concealed unimaginable danger. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "Gather every ship that can sail, every ally that will answer your call. The 13 who serve darkness have used their knowledge of the ancient ways to break seals that should never have been broken. When the unnamed deep fully wakes, it will send forth its servants, creatures beside which Umagor was but a minnow. The coasts of Middle-earth will not survive their coming unless we stand united." "And can we stand against such power?" Imrahil asked. "Perhaps," Mithrelas replied. "Círdan believes there is a way, dangerous beyond measure, requiring sacrifice that few would willingly make. But there is hope if we have the courage to embrace it." She reached into her cloak and drew forth something that made every observer step back in wonder. A crystal vial filled with water that seemed to hold its own light, bright as captured starfire. "Water from the fountain of the king in Númenor," she said reverently, "saved by my own hand on the last day before the downfall, carried with me through all our years of exile. Círdan believes that if this water could be taken to the very heart of the unnamed deep, it might serve to bind the ancient evil as we bound Umagor. But the binding would require a sacrifice greater than any we have yet made." Aragorn stared at the vial, understanding immediately what she meant: the life of the bearer. "More than life," she corrected. "The bearer's very existence would become part of the binding, their essence woven into the fabric of the world itself to hold the darkness at bay. They would not die. They would become something else entirely, a living seal that could never be broken, while Middle-earth endures." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Farazir stepped forward from among the gathered captains, his face serene with the peace of a decision long contemplated. "I will bear it," he said simply. "I who helped lead my people into darkness in the service of Ar-Pharazôn. Let me be the one to ensure that darkness never rises again." "No," Mithrelas said firmly. "This is my burden to bear. I was senior captain of the fleet, and the responsibility is mine." But Aragorn raised his hand, forestalling their debate. "There will be time to decide such matters when the final crisis comes," he said. "For now, we must prepare for war, unlike any Middle-earth has ever seen. Send word to Rohan, to Lothlorien, to every friend we have ever had. Tell them that the sea itself stands in peril, and with it, all the lands that touch its shores." As the council dispersed to begin the vast preparations that would be needed, Mithrelas remained behind, still holding the vial of sacred water. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, there is one more thing you should know. In our travels with Círdan, we learned something of your own fate in this coming war. The blood of Númenor flows in your veins, and that blood calls to the powers of the deep. When the final battle comes, you will face a choice that no king should have to make. What choice? Aragorn asked, though he feared he already knew. Between saving Middle-earth and ruling it, she replied. The binding will require not just one life, but the voluntary participation of all who carry the blood of the Sea Kings. You, your majesty, are the last and greatest of that line. Your sacrifice would strengthen the binding beyond any power to break it, but it would also mean that the age of kings ends with you. As evening fell over Minas Tirith, King Elessar stood alone upon his highest tower, gazing southward toward the growing darkness. In his heart, he already knew what choice he would make when the time came. He had been born to serve, not to rule, and if service required the ultimate sacrifice, then he would embrace it gladly. The last harbor of the redeemed fleet had become the first port of call for a war that would determine the fate of all creation. And somewhere in the far south, beneath waters black as the void between stars, something vast and ancient opened eyes that had been closed since the world was young, and began to rise toward the light it had always sought to devour. The final test was at hand, and none could say who would survive its passing, save that heroes would be needed, and heroes would answer whatever the cost.